Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 71, Ukraine the Latest. A conversation with Francis Dearnley. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin land, also called Ottawa, Canada. I'm very pleased to bring you this episode. After months, almost a year actually, of planning and reorganizing schedules because of emergencies and changes and developments in Eastern Europe, we can welcome to the podcast Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor for Audio of the Ukraine the Latest podcast published by the Telegraph newspaper in the UK. The brainchild of journalist David Knowles, Ukraine the Latest has covered Russia's criminal and inhuman war in Ukraine from its beginning 3 years ago. Francis has been integral to the show from day one, and I listen every day it's on. Francis's voice has become as familiar to me now as any one of my colleagues and neighbors physically in Ottawa. Francis is also an authority on European history, and his observations often show how that history influences what happens on the ground today in Ukraine. Last month, he was one of a small, select group of international journalists who sat down with and interviewed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. The reason I started Beyond Barbarossa, this podcast, is to inform listeners in Canada and in the English-speaking podiverse about the Eastern Front, the biggest part of the Second World War in Europe. Knowing this history helps us understand what's happening in Europe and around the world today, and that helps us make better decisions. That's what makes Francis an ideal guest for this podcast. So, please join me in welcoming Francis Dearnley, Executive Editor for Audio from the Telegraph's podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Welcome to the podcast, Francis.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Just to get started, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about your job at Ukraine the Latest and how you came to the podcast?
Certainly. Well, as with many things that have humble beginnings and grow over time, it was completely spontaneous and never really planned. A colleague of mine called David Knowles, who sadly passed away last year very suddenly, was working here at the Telegraph at the time as the head of our social media team. And when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, he said, would you be interested in coming on air live and just talking about the significance of this? I'm a historian by training, and he said you could offer a perspective from a historian looking back on the importance and significance of this moment from the perspective of somebody who's been following European history for a long time. And of course, I said I was very happy to. And so we did that live on X Spaces, or Twitter Spaces as it was known back then. And we did this for a few days, and we found there was quite an interested audience, not only in terms of analysis, but also just reporting what on earth was happening in February 2022. And then we found that it had an audience as a podcast if we released it unedited, and it continued to grow. And we have now been reporting in edited form, I'm happy to say. We still do the live broadcast at 1 o'clock every weekday London time, but in edited format with a podcast, and have been doing that for the entire duration of the war now. We haven't missed a weekday, except the occasional bank holiday or whatever, but we've been reporting consistently ever since then. So we provide very detailed military and political analysis every single day on what's happening in Ukraine and beyond.
I discovered your podcast very early on in the war, and I've always been impressed, and I haven't missed a day since. And I just have to say, back in September, I was on vacation in Nova Scotia and still had the podcast going. I plugged my phone into the car. When I started it up, I heard that deep sigh from Dominic Nichols telling us in a broken voice about David Knowles' passing. And I was so shocked, and I'm still saddened by it. But I must say, I have to praise you and Dominic and Adelaide now for continuing with such a really one of my favorite podcasts, let's put it that way. And like I say, I don't miss an episode.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, it was, I think what you've just described there was a feeling shared by many, many thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of listeners around the world. It certainly came as a terrible shock to us, but it's been something incredibly gratifying to be able to continue the work in his legacy and indeed expand it. So we just released a Ukrainian and Russian translations of each episode of the podcast as well, using advanced AI technology to duplicate our voices, but translating them. We have somebody else who's a native speaker who checks to make sure that the translations are good, but we're still trying to grow on the legacy of what he started.
That is also very impressive. I've heard little bits of it here and there. I speak a few words in Ukrainian, and that kind of blows me away. To dive into the current war and, of course, the subject matter of my podcast, which is the Second World War on the Eastern Front, back in February 2022, so that's 3 years ago, I noticed parallels between the history of the Second World War in Eastern Europe and the current situation in Ukraine, particularly in the political area. And I saw Russia taking the role of Germany of the 1930s. And also I saw a number of parallels, or I don't know, maybe just similarities with the West's reactions up to last November anyway. Do you see those same parallels? What is your perspective on that?
Certainly. Well, I think it's become something of a cliche now to say that we've returned to the theatre of the 1930s, but I think it's a cliche for a good reason. And I was reading recently, and I'm still working my way through them. I mean, they're very long, they're 6 volumes, as we all know. Churchill's memoirs of the Second World War, where he, of course, is recalling the period not only before the war, but then all the way through until the aftermath. And the first volume, The Gathering Storm, makes extremely alarming reading, I would say, because the arguments that are made with regards to Czechoslovakia and Poland and other countries that, as we all know, were gradually absorbed by Nazi Germany, are the same arguments that were being made or are being made now with regards to Ukraine, in terms of asking Ukraine to concede its sovereignty or to concede its territory for the good of peace in Europe, when talking about how naive certain attitudes have been towards, obviously in Churchill's case, Germany, but now Russia, taking what Russia says at face value, which of course was a mistake that was made by Chamberlain and others most famously. Although I would say that there is also very significant differences, which I think should alarm us even further. So the biggest difference from my perspective is that I think Chamberlain quite often gets a bad rep. Now, I think it's justified to a certain degree, to a significant degree, with Peace in Our Time, and I think also the naivety in the early 30s. But once Chamberlain sees the light, as it were, he doesn't hesitate in arming Britain and in preparing for what could be a very large-scale war. And of course, Hitler himself, as I'm sure your listeners will know, being so well informed on this, more so probably than I, blamed Chamberlain for him losing the war because of the delays that were caused in the launching of Operation Barbarossa, and also just generally in hesitating and letting Europe further arm and prepare for war when Germany obviously was in a stronger position to start it. Now, contrast that to today, where there is still a hesitancy in Europe to arm, despite what I would say is an obvious example of a fascistic state, which is growing and expanding its power militarily, severely dented by Ukraine, of course, but it is still rising, and it is still a danger. And indeed, I think there are now 5 or 6 intelligence services in Europe which are saying that Germany, Russia, that Russia is going to be able to launch further military attacks in perhaps 3 years, perhaps 5 years. And I think another element of this, which is underappreciated by most, although Macron did allude to this in his significant speech the other week, is that fascistic states become much more inclined towards conquest. Economically, it becomes necessary to wage war. And indeed, militarily, the pressure is on the political leaders to to make advances. And I think that we saw that, of course, in the example of the 1930s and 1940s, where, and I cite on the podcast all the time, probably my most cited book on the podcast, Adam Tooze's brilliant Wages of Destruction, where he talks about the central point, which is that Germany is a society that it's not, investing in its people with the grand Autobahn projects, and it doesn't recover itself on a healthy economic footing in a Keynesian model. It invests in militarism, knowing it is going to conquer. And in the same way, you could argue that that is Putin's attitude towards Ukraine. He is investing in the idea of him seizing vast territories in Ukraine and indeed beyond that. And so Europe needs to wake up, but I fear that it is not waking up perhaps to the same degree that it did in the late 1930s.
Right. Now, you're also known as an expert on the Napoleonic history, or is that just Dominic trolling us all?
I'd say something of an expert. Let's say a passionate enthusiast. I've studied it at university with some of the sort of Napoleonic field experts, which was a great privilege to do. But I would say that my knowledge is more from a place of passionate interest than detailed, profound understanding.
Yes, but it does, again, the echoes or the parallels have been evoked by Putin himself recently, saying after Macron's speech, Putin reminding the world what happened to the French when they invaded in the 1800s. But of course, that just led me to think, well, yes, but also Moscow was burned. So it's a strange thing to bring up. Is there anything from either period that we should be paying attention to now that, that could be instructive, I suppose, to understand the current situation?
One of the myths of the Russian campaign in the Napoleonic period is that, in a sense, it was won at Borodino with the burning of Moscow and the retreat that took place. Actually, Napoleon was far from finished with that disastrous campaign. He was still a powerful entity to be reckoned with in 1813 and 1814. And I think it's sometimes underappreciated the revolutions in development of military tactics that Russia underwent as a consequence of what took place in 1812. And yet we focus so extensively on that early part of the campaign because of Tolstoy and because of War and Peace. But in many ways, it's actually not necessarily the best tool for understanding what Russia really experienced, and indeed why Napoleon was defeated in the longer term. In fact, I think really you should see War and Peace as Tolstoy writing the 1860s about the Crimean War and placing it in 1812, i.e. this idea of a noble defeat. And of course, Borodino still was really in many ways a military stalemate. And yes, the burning of Moscow then necessitated a military defeat, but the war wasn't over in 1812. And I think Tolstoy is trying to say that the war isn't truly over with Crimea despite the Russian defeat in the 1860s. But that's by the by. I think in terms of lessons from the Napoleonic period, I think there are so many comparisons that one can make, although I'm quite struck actually at the moment, this is on my mind, how many seem very happy to, in a way, try and return to the 19th century. And what I mean by that is people saying now's the time to return to thinking about making compromises for peace, i.e. trying to strike deals over the heads of sovereign nations, as was done at the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic period. And they're sort of welcoming this. They're saying, let's get out of the paradigm of it being absolute victory, absolute defeat, as in the Second World War, and think in terms of compromise for the greater good.
Right.
But I would say if you really want to return to the 19th century, then that really is the restoration of might is right. And it is a defenestration of the post-war order built after 1945. And I think it is an extremely dangerous line of reasoning to go down. I think that if you look even at the models in the 20th century that were trying to perhaps emulate in essence the Congress of Vienna, so let's say Potsdam, let's say Versailles, I'd say they can hardly be considered great successes. I mean, one offers peace for 20 years, the other less than 18 months in essence. And so I think it's a very, very dangerous path to go down. 1945 tries to build a new world where it is not possible, and of course there are many failures, but where it is legally not permitted to seize territory over the heads of sovereign nations and to try and settle disputes by war. It seems there are a lot of people who are very content to go back to that world. But if you are willing to believe that, then nobody is safe. And you mentioned 1940s and other things that are relevant. Something that struck me, that people are saying, well, Russia is advancing in Ukraine, it's making progress, it's seized more territory now than at some other phases of the war. And I'd say, well, yes, but you can't really measure how well a war is going based on just geographical concerns. Because if you were to ask somebody to look at a map from, let's say, mid-1942,
Yes.
and they knew nothing about the Second World War, they would say, wow, well, Hitler's got this sewn up. He's made so much progress. He's in a very, very strong position. But of course, you and I know, and your listeners know, that actually the key decisions that are ultimately going to bring about the collapse of Nazi Germany were made in 1941. And so I think as well, these concerns and too much focus on the map and not understanding the economic, the political considerations, I think that also is quite dangerous.
Yes, and I think the economics of Russia today have eerie, again, parallels, I think, with the economy of Germany under Hitler. I'd like to pursue that idea, the parallels between Germany and the USSR in 1942 with Russia and Ukraine today. But before we get into that, I think we all need to take a short break to refill our coffees. We'll be right back. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Welcome to part 2 of Beyond Barbarossa, episode 71. I'm joined virtually by Francis Dearnley, executive editor for audio from Ukraine the Latest, the podcast on Russia's war on Ukraine from The Telegraph. Now, you mentioned a strategic development in Russia in the 1800s and perhaps even previous century and today. One of the features of Soviet strategy in the Second World War was maskirovka, or masking in English. The term captures camouflage, deception of all sorts. And at the same time, propaganda was a powerful tool in the 1930s and 40s for all sides. A feature of today's conflict is misinformation, which maybe we can see or characterize as a category of propaganda. How important is the misinformation today in today's conflict, the propaganda, as it were, in 2025?
I think it's hugely significant. I think we see the impact of Russian disinformation particularly acutely in the United States under the Trump administration. So many now senior officials in the Trump administration have said things that are just simply factually inaccurate. They're not questions of interpretation, they are factually inaccurate. And many of them, I think, are straight from the Kremlin in terms of these lies and manipulations. I mean, of course, there are many attacks on President Zelensky, but some of them are clearly just simply untrue in terms of decisions that he'd made, or decided that he's somehow financially profiting from the war, and that all of these weapons donations is going straight into his own personal coffers. I mean, this is just simply untrue, and yet it is everywhere. And I think that that's one of the changes that is concerning thinking longer term, is that, of course, propaganda has always been very important in war. But if you say are comparing the 1930s to today, the 1930s had very set organs of information. So, for example, in Britain, you've got the newspapers, and you've got the BBC, and you've got rumour, I suppose you could say, or hearsay, and dodgy radio feeds. But broadly speaking, most people are getting their information from sources that are trusted within the nations concerned. And that, of course, means that accurate information is more readily available and more readily believed. Whereas today, I'd say that trust in those kind of mainstream media organizations, whether they be newspapers, whether they be broadcasters, has been substantially eroded. And as a consequence of that, we're seeing them seeking out alternative sources of information, particularly on social media. And that is not regulated, and that is not a place where information has a tendency to be prioritizing accuracy over eccentricity. One goes on social media, and what's so striking is that what tends to do best is the most dramatic, not what is the most accurate. And so many people are getting their main news from that, or TikTok, which of course is in the hands of an autocratic regime which is trying to sow its own discourse.
Yes.
So I think it is extremely troubling, and it requires a particular sensitivity training, I think, for people to be informed citizens, to be aware of the dangers of believing everything that they read on social media. The problem from the establishment's perspective is, if I'm to articulate it in those terms, whether it be the establishment media or broadcasters, is that they've had a pretty bad few years in terms of trustiness. I mean, I think if you particularly look at just one example that comes into my head, the lockdowns, the pandemic, it was the orthodoxy of the media at the time, not my own paper, I'm proud to say, but for many organisations in the United States and in Britain, that was not likely to be a lab leak, that this was disinformation, distortion coming out of unsavoury places. But actually now, I think even the Germans, who were one of the biggest sceptics of this narrative, think there's about 90% chance that it originated in a Wuhan lab. So when you're getting things like that wrong, and many other instances of, say, people saying it's impossible for war to begin in Europe, it's all lies and distortions, people do seek alternative sources of information. And in democratic societies, of course, they have the right to. I'm not somebody who's pro-censorship or anything like that, or pro the idea that there should be overlords of truth who are telling people what to think. But what I'm saying is that there are dangers that we leave people more exposed to disinformation, and this disinformation is something that is quite particular. This isn't a difference of opinion. This is information that is manufactured to deceive. It is propaganda. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that we're in an age of new propaganda now, that it's not just alternative takes, not just hot takes from different interesting viewpoints. This is content that has been produced by somebody in the Kremlin or in the FSB, whoever, who is pummeling this stuff out into the world to deceive you. And that is not a good thing to be putting your faith in. And yet, unfortunately, many people do. And it is encouraged by people like Elon Musk on Twitter, who exercise.
Given that, and given the danger, what can we do to identify this kind of misinformation and protect ourselves against it, or even to counter it?
I think still putting one's faith in reliable sources is perhaps one of the most important things. I don't think that the age of the media having importance is over. Our own editor here at The Telegraph, I think, makes an excellent point when he says that actually in an age of increasing disinformation and unreliable sources, there perhaps will be a time, and perhaps we're already there, where newspapers, more trusted journalism with trained journalists, people who've worked on this, people who have ethical standards they have to adhere to, their importance will increase over time. And so I'm not somebody who believes that we should be encouraging a world that sees the end of of journalistic endeavours. And sometimes great journalism costs time and money to produce, investigations particularly. It's not something that can just be summarised in 140 characters. Nuance requires time. It requires expertise, and it requires focus. And I think that all of us should say, I want to get my information from people who really know what's going on, and to read those sources or hear or listen to those sources that they feel are providing that. And I'm very proud that on Ukraine the Latest, I think that because we've been reporting on this ever since day one, that we do have that trust from our listeners. That means that people do feel that they can come to us and get accurate information. But we would never claim to have all of the answers, and we put our hands up and say when we don't know all the answers. And we have many experts who have differing interpretations on what they see, and we give them the time and the space in order to talk. But you've got to have certain, I think, foundational principles that you should be looking for. And as I say, it is people who want to produce truth and want to get to the heart of the matter. And unfortunately, I think that in many cases, it's not the way people are necessarily being incentivized to approach their media. It's all about the drama.
Yes, that strikes me a lot, is that people will say, oh, you can't trust the mainstream media because they got, the pandemic wrong, they got this other thing wrong. But then they'll just accept wholesale whatever comes out of someone who's just making extraordinary, sensational claims that are, on the face of it, unbelievable to begin with. And I'm glad you brought up the idea that your organization and organizations like the Telegraph and other major media do expend the resources and aren't loath to travel, for example, as you have, to Ukraine and to other areas. So that brings me to this question. The people who are there, not just in Ukraine, but in other nearby countries like Poland or the Baltics, obviously they have a different perspective on the current conflict, and also, as I've learned, very different perspective on the Second World War from me here in a comfortable Canada. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about what you've seen in that regard when you've been in Central Europe or Eastern Europe?
Well, this for me is one of the most interesting aspects of this conflict. I'm going to try and not be too academic about this, but I think that when one approaches contemporary events through, let's say, a particularly historical lens, or indeed past events even, there's a sort of mentality that we can learn certain fundamental rules that need to be followed. So, for example, unpunished evil grows is a maxim that we often talk about, given the lesson from the 1930s, and that things should have been done differently as a consequence. And I think that approach to history and to international relations really has a very long history. It goes back to a certain degree, you could say, some of the ancient writers, certainly Machiavelli, because he's applying lessons from different periods and saying that these are fundamental truths to human nature and they're applicable to all time. And so when you approach this current war, you would say that actually there are similar rules that need to be, lessons that need to be applied here, that every country, regardless of their own histories, would say, yeah, unpunished evil grows, we need to act decisively. But what we've actually seen, to your point, is that every country is not approaching it in that way. It's approaching it through the experience of their own national prisms, their own relativism, as it were. With regards to Russia, with regards to war in general. And it means that is why there has been this massive patchwork in differing responses to the war. Whether you've got that initial German hesitancy of only providing 5,000 helmets, you've got other countries, say in the Baltics, who are far more hawkish and proactive in this idea of supporting Ukraine and mobilizing themselves. Then you've got countries like Britain, which certainly has not invested anywhere near enough in military affairs, in my view, but has been decisive early on in the war in seeing that this was wrong, and had the history and the sense of foresight and proactiveness, which again is a product of its history, to make decisive decisions, which may well have been pivotal in the early weeks of the war, particularly in terms of the weapons that were provided to the Ukrainians to defend Kyiv. So, yeah, there are very different attitudes to this conflict. And I spoke to a very senior official only a few weeks ago, former Ukrainian official, and he said that when they were speaking to Germans, that they were trying to make this pitch to say, look, this is your opportunity to lead Europe again, to be figure. You can mobilize, you can help defend us, and in a sense, this will be your redemption for the horrors of that you put on the continent for a century. But what he said is that actually, this is a very unattractive message to the Germans, because they don't want to lead. So if you say this is your opportunity to lead, they flinch and they want to do less, not more.
Yeah.
And that again speaks to the difference in experiences here. And that is something you have to travel, you have to speak to different people in different countries to really, really understand where they're all coming from. But that differs from the approach that many people take to, as I say, in academic circles at least, foreign affairs and military strategy, which they see as universally applicable laws that go all the way back, as I say, to Machiavelli, to Clausewitz, whoever you want to cite. But it's just not the way our politicians think. Now, you could say that that's a bad thing. I probably would be inclined to agree with that. But it is the reality that we're in. And clearly, many, many people were naive. And you've got to know your history.
Yes, unfortunately, I find a lot of people really don't. And that's what my podcast is all about. This is at least here in North America, there's very little understanding, appreciation of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. It's very much focused on what the United States, and a lesser degree, but still prominent to what the UK did. And of course, here in Canada, we like to talk about our accomplishments or our military's accomplishments. Bringing this back closer to home, I've heard, and I keep hearing, that people in the UK, and not just the government, are very much pro-Ukraine at the moment, and they support the idea of continuing that military support. Is that an accurate way of describing the attitude in the UK today?
We're very fortunate in the UK compared to the United States in that defence strategy, defence policy, the matter of Ukraine is not a partisan issue, it's a bipartisan consensus. And so the mainstream parties, whether it be the Conservatives or the Labour Party, which are the two, in essence, parties of government in this country, are in agreement that Ukraine requires our support. And every Prime Minister that we've had since the war began, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, now Keir Starmer, have been adamant in terms of the importance for Ukraine. Of course, there are nuances within that. I think that Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss particularly saw themselves as domestic-focused prime ministers. I think Keir Starmer would like to, by inclination, but actually he's been very, very hands-on in the last few weeks. And to his credit, I think he's done a good job with the hands that he's been dealt, as it were. I think Boris Johnson saw himself more as a Churchillian figure, his favourite hero from history, and so was much more engaged and critical in foreign affairs. And I've interviewed him, and he follows the war very, very closely on a granular level. I mean, he really, really understands it in a way that I think most other politicians would, even in Europe, struggle to articulate. So I think that Britain is very much on Ukraine's side and wants to do more. And John Healey, who's our Defence Secretary, has been passionate about this for a very long time. So I don't predict there to be any decline in support for Ukraine. I think it's more likely to only increase as we enter this phase of perhaps, I think it's a very big perhaps, some kind of peace deal, ceasefire that may well be inclined to see British troops on the ground. And as I say, in this government's credit, they have said that they would be willing to put British troops' lives on the line in Ukraine to uphold a ceasefire. It's quite a remarkable turnaround from early on.
It really is. Yes. Now, but among the political levels, but down on the ground, the street level, as it were, does the general population, if I can call it that, also echo that or portray that concern, that support?
It's a good question. I think polling would suggest yes in the broad terms. I haven't got the latest figures to hand. There have been very regular polling on this that would be saying that yes, absolutely, most people are very supportive of Ukraine. I should say that, to be completely accurate, that there are parties that are more sceptical of anything that would be considered military intervention or military support for Ukraine. On the far left, there are political figures in this country who would say that, whether it be as a vestige of their old Soviet sympathies, to be frank, that they don't want to see us doing anything that would be anti-Russian, or that they just don't like, so they say, the idea of doing anything that encourages militarism. on the further right too. I hesitate to say far right because I think it's rather oversimplistic, but on the further right, let's say, there are those who I would say are more inclined towards the idea of peace at any cost. Ukraine's far away, it's not our business. Or indeed, perhaps would even go culturally further and say that they see that the great issue of our time civilizationally is around immigration and traditional values and this battle against the liberal consensus. And so they have some kind of affinity with Russia, which I find personally very morally troubling and also just frankly completely inaccurate when one knows anything about Russia. But it does exist. But is it mainstream? No, I don't believe it is. The danger for Britain in the longer term is that party or individuals who are more inclined towards that may become more powerful as a consequence, not of their Ukraine stance, but just as a consequence of domestic issues here. And so a bit like we've seen in Germany with the AfD. The reason the AfD are being successful in Germany is not so much because they are Russian sympathizers, but because they're seen as the only party who want to act on one of the key issues at the moment, which is immigration. And that's the danger here in Britain too, is that one issue means that you're actually voting for parties that perhaps have views that you disagree with on foreign affairs. And I think that's something that we're seeing European-wide.
I guess that's the weakness of our current system, is that these things get lumped together, and if you accept one tenet, you have to accept them all, even of a group that you may disagree with. This is such a fascinating conversation. I don't want it to ever end, but I think you, Francis, and I and the listeners need another short break for water or coffee or whatever we're drinking. So don't go too far, please, and neither you, listeners. We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by the Eastern Front Trilogy, the true story of a Canadian man, Maurice Bury, drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941, just in time to be thrown between the jaws of the USSR and Nazi Germany at the launch of the greatest land invasion in history, the monstrous war called Operation Barbarossa. It comes in 3 volumes: Army of Worn Souls, Under the Nazi Heel, and Walking Out of War. The Eastern Front Trilogy is the story of the largest and deadliest side of the Second World War, seen through the eyes of a man who was there from the earliest days in 1941, through Germany's grinding occupation of Ukraine, and finally to the savage end of the war in Berlin. You can find 3 individual volumes as ebooks exclusively on Amazon, or purchase the 3-volume complete paperback on any online book retailer or at your local bookstore. To learn more about the Eastern Front Trilogy, visit scottburyauthor.com. Welcome back to part 3 of our conversation with Francis Dearnley of Ukraine the Latest, the daily podcast from The Telegraph about the war in Ukraine. We were talking before the break about the general feeling of support of the politicians and the general population of the UK in support of Ukraine through the Russian invasion. But how long can this popular support last? On this side of the Atlantic, I think in Canada in general, people I'm speaking to are very much in support of Ukraine as well, and of supporting it. The latest news that I saw was the first tranche of some Canadian support of $1.2 billion or so has reached Ukraine, or is now being released. But in the U.S., of course, there's a growing strain of opposition to continuing support for Ukraine. Do you think that strain in Europe is growing? Is Ukraine weariness, Ukraine fatigue, a growing part of the discussion?
I think actually the reverse at this moment. If you'd asked me that question perhaps 3 months ago, I would have said that yes, that may well be the direction of travel that we're on. But the decisions made by Donald Trump in the United States with regard to Europe, with regard to Ukraine, have led to a sharp U-turn from many countries in their attitudes on this. And I think that many countries that were very hesitant to do more are suddenly realizing that actually there is a compulsion now, a necessity for their own defense, not just for Ukraine's, but this is much, much bigger now, to do much more, whether it be military support for Ukraine, whether it be political support, whether it be military expansion, rearmament, you name it. The energy here is like something I've never seen in my lifetime in terms of trying to find solutions. And I think that it's self-interest, fundamentally, people realizing that we're in danger. I mean, at the end of the day, Article 5, for now at least, still exists. NATO still exists. Many countries would be obliged to fight were the worst to happen. And now they can't guarantee on the protection of the United States. That leaves all of them far more vulnerable. And as a consequence, they're far more engaged with the issue.
Right. So it seems that that's galvanized a public opinion outside of the US at any rate.
Yes. I mean, I thought Germany is a good example of this, right? Like, Germany's been a country that public opinion polls has always been, I'd say, slightly more skeptical of Ukraine. I think there's multiple reasons for that, which I won't bore you with now. I mean, you'll know from being a listener to the podcast, but I think that if you look at what's happened to Germany as a consequence of Donald Trump's decision in the recent election, Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, his policy is much more about rearmament, much more about weapons procurement, and this is a big change. This is a big shift.
Yes, it's shifted things dramatically here in Canada as well.
Of course.
What do you think is the biggest thing that people here in the West, Western Europe as well as North America, misunderstand or need to understand or appreciate more about the war in Ukraine today?
Gosh, well, I am inclined to agree with the argument President Zelensky has made many times throughout the war, which I was honoured to hear him say in person just a couple of weeks ago when he was addressing a small room of journalists in Stansted Airport before he left for the next round of summits. This was after the major London summit about a fortnight ago. And that is that Ukraine is Europe's front line, that it is fighting a war, that it is costing not only its own future and freedom that's at stake, but the future of our generation and the generations to come. That if Ukraine loses this fight, that Russia is unlikely to stop, that it will probe through hybrid warfare and other military means or non-military means in the rest of Europe, whether it be political engagement. It will also have access to vast swathes of material in Ukraine that it could then use as well in turning it on Europe, and that this is an extremely dangerous thing, as well as the precedent that one sets as an international community with regards to might being right, and as I say, a throwing out of the international rules-based order, which I know many people roll their eyes at as a term anyway, because they say that it's just wishful thinking that ever existed. But the fact is that it still counts for something if you break international law, I would argue. And if you want that to continue being the case, then you need to defend the principles that were enshrined at the end of the Second World War, which is that you cannot just invade sovereign nations and be allowed to benefit from that. And that has ramifications for all of us in a world where there are these huge power blocks. It is not a world that is as fragmented and power shared as it was perhaps just 30 years ago. There are huge blocks, whether it be China, whether it be India, whether it be the United States. I hesitate to say Russia, really, because I think that actually their economy is the size of Spain and they've got a lot of territory and influence, but actually they're certainly not the Soviet Union. But even so, you've got countries that are big and are seeking to control even more territory than they currently do. And if you want to avoid a world where you could be next, then it is all of our interests to be supporting Ukraine and see it as being a fight for our own futures as much as for that one country's.
Now to bring it back to my audience's main interest, I hope, given your historical background, what do you think that people in the West misunderstand the most about the Second World War?
I think the Soviet Union and its war is grossly misunderstood, particularly with regards to scale. And I think most people, as you alluded to earlier on, do see it through perhaps the Americans see it through their national prism, Canada, and their losses, and quite rightly, sacrifices were made by people's kinsmen, and it makes sense. But the numbers that the Soviet Union lost have profoundly shaped its outlook and has, in a way, left it more susceptible to being manipulated into this idea that the West is at war with it. And you could say that's connected to the legacy of Napoleon as well. But this idea that the West has it against us, and if we give an inch, then they could invade us again and cause this absolute devastation of millions lost, not just 500,000, but I think it's 26 million. It's just astronomical, and I think that is often underappreciated and is so important for understanding the mentality. Certainly, something that's changed for me, though, as a consequence of this war is it's underscored something that tends to be forgotten, which is that Russia is not the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was a different beast, and that Ukraine was in many ways the front line of Barbarossa. I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with the famous memoir Forgotten Soldier by Guy Segers, who describes in vivid detail the horrors of the Eastern Front from the experience of a Wehrmacht soldier. And of course, many of the battles that he's describing are taking place in modern day Ukraine. And it is Ukraine that suffers the most as bearing the brunt of the German assault during Barbarossa. And I think that's really forgotten. And so when Russia tries to claim that it's the one that lost the most by the percentage of its population, actually it's modern day Ukraine, if you look at it. And I think it needs to be very much emphasized that it cannot take credit for the lives of Ukrainians who in many cases were executed civilians by the Einsatzgruppen and other entities that know the horrors that the Germans carried out in the Soviet Union. So I think that is underappreciated here. I think also as well, one thing I've seen that was very early on shifted is certainly the orthodoxy when I was studying the Second World War was this idea that the reason the Russians soldiers, and it was predominantly Russian soldiers, not from other territories, I don't believe, within the Soviet Union, it was predominantly Russian, were so inclined to commit the mass rapes in Berlin and Germany when they were on their path through towards the end of the war, was as revenge for what the Germans had carried out in their country. But I think many people are now saying, well, actually, given the behavior we've seen Russia conduct on Ukrainians, which these are in theory people who they have been taught to think are their kinsmen to a certain degree. Obviously Ukrainians don't see it that way, but certainly Russian education has tried to encourage it that way. It would suggest that there is a deeper cultural rot, whether it just be in the Russian armed forces or indeed in society more widely, which is willing to conduct warfare in a way that would be considered alien to most Western armed forces, and we've led, I think, to a reassessment of the Second World War as a consequence of this war behaviour that we've seen. So those would be a few examples at the top of my head.
And those actually echo some of the experiences of my father-in-law, which I wrote about in my book, The Eastern Front. There was very obvious discrimination. The Russians tended to see the Ukrainians as less. Kinsmen, perhaps, Slavs as also, but less. And yes, the story he told was that when they were still in Russia or Belarus or the Baltics, the officers said, hands off the women. But when they crossed into Germany, it was, do what you want. And those were the words of the officers.
Look, I mean, there's so many testimonies that would be echoing them, I think. I mean, the scale of the horror is just underappreciated, I think, because there was a sort of collective silence at the end of the Second World War as to what had taken place in German society that to a degree has broken, but I still think will never be fully known or uncovered because of the shame of the times. And I mean, it was still deemed extremely controversial when Anthony Beevor published his book Berlin 1945, that summoned by the Russian ambassador to speak to him, to say, how can you do this? How can you distort history in this way? How can you talk about this? And he said it's all out there. It's all in the archives. It's all in the material. But even if it is, you can't be saying this sort of stuff. It's harmful, and it just speaks so much to the Russian mentality. And that was in the 1990s, and it was considered pretty revelatory then. I mean, just whilst we're on this subject of manner in which the Russians behaved, and also how the difference in outlook, to say that Ukrainians had versus Russians, I think it's always an underappreciated aspect of the war, the way in which in the Western Soviet Union, many people, particularly in Ukraine, were at least welcoming some of the Wehrmacht soldiers, that they were this idea of being liberated from the horrors of Stalinism after the Holodomor. And of course, we all know what happened next, which is, I would argue, is an underappreciated strategic error made by Hitler, one that it was impossible for him to ever avoid, because he wasn't waging war rationally, he was waging war ideologically, which meant it was impossible for him to see Slavs as equal to the soldiers that he was sending in. But, you know, if he had thought in terms of, I'm going to use these people and keep them on side, I'm not going to wage a genocidal war against them, then perhaps the Soviet Union could have collapsed. But instead, we all know what happened, which is that he waged a genocidal war in the East, and it eventually meant that people did turn very quickly against the Nazi forces. And I think that did have a major impact on the war on the Eastern Front.
Do you think that the current conflict in Russia and Ukraine today has changed your perspective or your thinking or your conceptualization of the Second World War?
I think it's become much more relevant than I thought it ever would in my lifetime. I think I would say that from the perspective of many people of my generation, so I was born in 1992, so in a sense I'm a child of Francis Fukuyama. What I mean by that is not that we all grew up knowing about the end of history, but this kind of mentality that was mainstream at the time, obviously post the collapse of the Soviet Union and sort of hybrid wars being conducted in the Middle East. The consensus was, we're never going to see conventional warfare in Europe again, and therefore learning about the First and Second World War, there's a kind of nostalgia, there's a kind of coziness to learning about it. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not important, that it's not profoundly moving, and I'll never forget the first time I ever visited the First World War battlefields on a school trip. So I'm not trying to dismiss in any sense the importance of the events, even when I was growing up. But I never thought that the lessons of that time would be as pertinent and being experienced in real time in my lifetime. And certainly my generation were not encouraged to think in those terms. And I think that has had a massive impact to a certain degree on how some younger people and some even older people approach the war. I think they find it very hard to conceptualize the war crimes that are taking place on European soil. And I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but if we look, returning to the Second World War, many people now look at the period and find it absolutely unbelievable that more people weren't talking about the Holocaust that was taking place at the time. But it wasn't really until people actually saw the concentration camps and they couldn't hide away, and when more and more testimony was released, the Eichmann trial was, of course, hugely significant in raising awareness of the issue, that people suddenly realized the horror that had been allowed to continue because of that ignorance. Well, I think what we're seeing in this war is similar, in that the war crimes that are being committed have some echoes, some parallels. I think the Holocaust is a particular kind of evil, but in terms of the way that children are being processed and kidnapped and taken to Russia and re-educated in camps, has echoes of that period. And I think that we're seeing, as I say, the ways that actually you can see more easily how people get distracted, people decide not to focus, whether it be because they've been told that this is impossible to take place, which is what people thought in the 1930s, and people, I think many people do psychologically believe it is sort of impossible that this is taking place now. As well as people being predominantly focused on self-interest, i.e. military strategy, political ramifications for their own countries. And that comes first. And I think that was true in the 1930s, and it's true today. And that has changed, I think, my outlook, because I believed, perhaps naively, that when we said never again, that we really meant that. And so that when the war crimes came to light, that it would galvanize the public, it would galvanize politicians to do more. But in fact, it really didn't. And so I think it has changed my outlook on the Second World War, and not necessarily in positive ways.
Now, my last thing is I'm going to try to channel David Knowles a little bit. Is there anything that you think we should stress more that we haven't yet in our conversation?
No, I think we've done a pretty good overview. I mean, I'm very aware that on your podcasts, it's much more of a granular focus, and I'm obviously speaking here in pretty broad brush terms. But I think that there is a place for that. And so I would say that it is as important in this war, which of course is something that we try and do on the podcast, is balance these two things, to focus on the granular, because it really matters, the numbers of weapons deliveries that are deployed to Ukraine, or indeed the North Koreans, and what they've given the Russians to enable them to fight. That granular detail really, really matters. But I think sometimes it can be easy to get bogged down and to lose sight of the bigger picture. And it is interesting to me that the narrative has somewhat shifted, which is people just saying, well, we just need peace now. You know, both sides are wanting to fight this, and maybe we just want peace, and are forgetting why this war started, who started it, and the only way that we're going to be able to get it to stop, which is when Russia is incentivized to stop. We must not lose sight of that. And so it is as important to focus on the specific as it is on the broad brush, forgive me, as it is on the specific.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate your time on this, Francis.
No, it's a pleasure, Scott. And I'm aware that we've been trying to do this for a very long time, and we've been commuting. So I'm sorry it's taken so long, but I'm glad we could do it.
Thank you again, Francis. That unmistakable voice, and yes, it does sound posh, was Francis Dearnley, executive editor for audio of The Telegraph, and one of the main voices of the excellent and unmissable podcast, Ukraine the Latest. There's a link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. Don't forget that Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to every episode. And your support really makes a big difference to me, to the show, and to Ukrainian people. To become a supporter, just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support that's right for you. And while I have you here, I'd like to extend a special thanks to all Patreon supporters. Whether you become a patron or not, please hit that follow button. And if you have a minute, please give the cast a rating or a review on whichever podcast platform you listen on. That helps other history buffs find us. If you find I've made any errors, please let me know. My address is scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca, or you can reach me through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. I'm also on Blue Sky, scottthewriter.bsky.social. And you can find me on Threads and on Instagram and on Facebook. And my own website is writtenword.ca. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next episode, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina. One more thing. Canada is a free, sovereign country, and always will be.